Awesome. So, welcome to another week of Lunch Money brought to you by Shareises. So, at Shareises, our purpose is to create the most financially empowered generation.
And for those of you who are new to Lunch Money, we do these every Thursday at lunchtime, and it's a place where you as investors can hear from the people leading some of the companies available on the Shareises platform and other investing experts.
And Lunch Money is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And please, if you are listening to the podcast, take a moment to leave a rating and comment on Apple Podcasts. We would really appreciate it. So my name is Alice. I am a financial analyst here at Shareises, and I'm joined by Chris.
Yes, hello, I'm Chris, and I am the product owner of the new markets team. And before we get into just today's discussion, there's a legal disclaimer, which is investing involves risk. You aren't guaranteed to make money, and you might lose the money you started with. Any information we provide is general only and current at this time. If you're looking for help with your investment choices, we recommend talking to a licensed financial advice provider, and we won't be providing any personalized advice as a part of this webinar.
Also, just as a quick reminder, if you have any questions, you can submit them through the Ask a Question button down below. Please don't leave any questions in the discussion or chat area, as they are likely to be missed.
And please be kind and respectful towards our speakers, your fellow viewers, because otherwise we will need to take steps to remove you from the webinar, and we don't want to do that.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. So today we are joined by Marc England, who is the CEO of Genesis Energy, the electricity generator and retailer. So Marc is here today to chat about the year that has been for Genesis Energy and how it plans to empower New Zealand's sustainable future. So welcome, Marc.
Drum roll for Marc's entrance. We'll just wait for Marc to pop in.
Here he is. Awesome. Hi, Marc. Looks like your microphone might just be muted. There we go.
Good.
Yeah, I don't know how to unmute it.
Oh, no, we're good. We can hear you now.
There you go. Someone's unmuted me. Good afternoon, Alice and Chris. Good.
Perfect. Welcome, Marc. Thanks for taking your time out of your Thursday lunchtime to chat with us and Shareises investors. So yeah, let's get into it. To kick us off, could you just give us a bit of an overview of yourself and your career?
Yeah, so I've been CEO of Genesis for a little over 5 years now, probably 5.5 years. I moved here for the job from Australia immediately. I'd been in Australia for 3 years prior to that, on the executive of a company called AGL Energy. And prior to that, I worked in the UK, most recently for a similar kind of company to Genesis called British Gas. It was owned by Centrica PLC, but also a generator, retailer of electricity and supplier of gas. And earlier in my career, I was at Ford Motor Company, and prior to that, I was in the oil and gas sector right after uni. So I started off life as an engineer, and I've kind of evolved through finance roles into general management, and now the CEO of Genesis.
Beautiful. Thank you. And could you tell us a bit about Genesis Energy? I'm interested in the company, how it operates, and what the different business divisions are.
Yeah, so Genesis emanates from the original ECNZ in New Zealand. We used to be a nationalised industry for electricity, and it was split up about 20 years ago. Actually, about 30 years ago now, I think. So we're one of the 4 that came from that, and we started off life as a state-owned enterprise, and then in 2014 we were partially privatized, listed on the NZX government. We describe ourselves not as an electricity company, but as an energy company, because we participate in the electricity sector, obviously, but also across gas and LPG. We have 3 P&L or profit centers that we report. We have our Coupe joint venture, where we've got 46% of the joint venture offshore gas. We've got our wholesale division, which generates electricity and also sources and procures gas. And then we got our retail business that retails electricity, gas, and LPG. And we might get into LPG later because some of your clients might be LPG customers, and it's one of the fastest growing fuels in New Zealand at the moment.
Cool, fantastic, thank you. And Marc, could you give us a bit of an overview of how the electricity and energy market works in New Zealand from a top-down view?
Yes, and apologies for the delay if everyone's feeling the delay I am, but we'll try, maybe it'll narrow over time. The electricity sector in New Zealand is a competitive market, whether you operate in the wholesale end of it or the retail end of it. In the wholesale end, it's an open market. It's called an energy-only market, where if you generate electricity, you get paid for the megawatt hours that you generate. You don't get paid to just have plant available. You get paid when you're generating. So it creates a merit order, and often the lowest cost generation will generate first. And depending on demand in the market, every half hour of the period, a market operator calls on various generation units, and the price is set in the wholesale market based on the last unit to run. So if you're the lowest cost generation, you're getting a margin between your cost and the highest priced unit in the market at that point in time. And electricity is incredibly volatile from a demand perspective. So we as consumers use a completely different amount of electricity at different times of the day. And often the highest consumption happens in the early evening, when everyone either gets home or is home in a lockdown context, and turns the oven on, starts cooking dinner, maybe heating's going on in winter. And so the highest demand is late evening, late afternoon, early evening. And then you also have a peak in the morning. But the difference between your sort of overnight demand and your peak demand can be 4 or 5 times, particularly for residential customers. So one of the challenges in the wholesale electricity market is making sure there are enough plants available and generating plants to meet the demand for every period of time during a 24-hour period. And that market, as we call it, is set up to ensure that happens. In the retail market, it's a bit different. We generally mostly have fixed prices. It's less volatile from a pricing perspective. Customers pay a price that might be updated once a year at most. And unless you're exposed to spot, which some large industrials are, you have that fixed price. And effectively, retailers, whether they're part of a wholesale retail business like we are, or they're independent retailers, will buy off the wholesale market in the short term and the medium and long term over time to ensure they have certainty of their costs, so they can be sure that when they price their customers, they know what margin they're going to make. So you have two markets operating simultaneously, but with quite different dynamics, one with very volatile pricing and one with very stable pricing for consumers.
So sort of going off the back of that, and also factoring in those different business divisions that you mentioned before, where does Genesis's, most of their revenue come from? And what are the key drivers of your company's revenue?
Yeah, so our key sources of revenue, the primary source of revenue will be our customer book. So our customers paying their bills. Because we have an internal transfer price between our power generation and our customer retail business. So our retail business will pay our power generation business for the electricity and then pass that through to customers' bills. So the majority comes from retail, but we also, as a large generator, we also expose to the wholesale market more broadly. So we're selling our power into the market where we're generating more than we need to serve our customers. We'll be selling that into the market, and there'll be a revenue there. And then there's obviously revenue moving around for gas. We're selling and buying gas, and there's a few other smaller revenue streams there too. So Genesis is probably the most diverse generator retailer of electricity and energy company in New Zealand, because we're split between the North and the South Island. We've got 2 hydro schemes in the North Island, 1 hydro scheme in the South Island, and we've got 1 thermal plant in the North Island. And we're also quite diverse from a fuels perspective, because we don't only retail electricity, we retail electricity, gas, and LPG. So that diversity of earnings is quite important to us from an investor proposition, because you've got volatility in all parts of any business, but it gives us that spread that means that in any given period, we can be quite sure of the returns we're going to be able to deliver for investors.
Cool. And so, as you mentioned before, the electricity industry in New Zealand is very competitive. And so how do you differentiate yourself from other energy providers and electricity companies in the country? Is it that diversity aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So electricity is probably the most diverse fuel of the three, because we sell electricity, gas, and LPG. There's probably, depending on where you are in the country, there's 20 to 30 different retailers you could choose to supply your electricity. And because it's a virtual product in some ways, because it doesn't matter who your retailer is, you're still going to receive electricity through the lines and through your meter. It's quite easy to switch, and the market's been set up to create that competition. I often describe it as a sort of low barriers to entry, but quite high barriers to success. It's quite easy to be an electricity retailer, but it's quite hard to be a successful one because of the complexities of the sector. So as a consumer, that's good. And New Zealand is probably one of the most competitive retail markets in the world for electricity. The way we compete is our vision is to be an energy manager, not an energy retailer. And what we mean by that is, historically, if you look over the last 100 years, nothing has really changed in our sector. Since the light bulb was invented and big power stations were developed to produce electricity and send it down poles and wires long distances to the communities that needed it, 100 years has been about, we give you the electrons to consume in your home or your business, and we send you a bill at the end of the month and you pay us for that. What we're trying to do as a business is differentiate ourselves, because everyone is offering effectively the same product. It's the same electron. By giving customers much more knowledge and advice about what they can do in their home to either be more efficient or be less carbon intensive. So we have a purpose, which is to empower New Zealand's sustainable future, which we put out there a year ago. And so we're starting to evolve the insights, the knowledge and advice we're giving our customers into that space. But so far, the last couple of years, if you're a Genesis customer and you have our Energy IQ app and you fill out our home profile, so you tell us how many bedrooms you've got, how you heat your home, and tomorrow. So that's one of the differentiators. We have algorithms that calculate based on the weather and your historical consumption patterns what it's going to cost you tomorrow and every day of the next 7 days of the week. We can tell you how your home compares to other homes like yours. And we're starting to build up a bigger picture for you that allows you to make some choices. We now offer advice in terms of notifications around what you can do to conserve power if you want to. And you're going to see us do much more of that. So we're in an industry that really hasn't changed for over 100 years, and we're trying to change it. And we're doing that with data, analytics, and insight to give consumers much more choice. And we said a few years ago we wanted to put control in our customers' hands, and that was another way of saying what I've just said, which is, instead of a big company like Genesis making all the choices for you, we want you to make the choices that matter for you, but we're going to give you the knowledge to do that. And that's our differentiator.
Oh, that's really interesting, Marc. Something I'm quite curious to hear about is you mentioned before about how you are in part still a state-owned entity, like the government still has a shareholding in the company. On top of that, the electricity industry is regulated in New Zealand. What role does the regulator and also the government sort of have on your operations?
So two different stakeholders there for us. I'll talk about regulator first, and then maybe government second. So there's a pretty strong regulator in New Zealand for electricity called the Electricity Authority. They set the rules by which we all operate, and they're mandated to ensure fair and good competition exists in the sector. And they're constantly holding us to account. Some of that's very visible, sometimes in the media, some of it less so. But just like banking has a strong regulator in the FMA, the electricity sector does too. And that's actually why we've got so much competition, and that's why consumers are getting so much choice, because the regulator has played that role for a while now. Regulation is always evolving, and sometimes there's lots of noise made about regulatory intervention is one of the words that's often used. But my view is changes to the regulation and the framework within which we operate, if it improves the outcomes for consumers, is a good thing, and we should embrace it, and we should be open to it, and we shouldn't expect the status quo to be around forever. But in my 5 years in New Zealand, this has still remained a pretty open, free market where competition drives outcomes rather than the regulator interferes in trying to design outcomes for consumers, which is what can happen and has happened in other markets too. So I think we've got a pretty healthy retail market, particularly in New Zealand. In terms of the government, I look at the government in two parts. We've got our shareholder as government, with the finance minister, Grant Robinson, being our shareholding minister. We treat every other investor, certainly institutional investor. We meet with them every 6 months, but they never interfere as investor. And I often say to other institutional investors, they interfere less than a 10% shareholder would. They don't appoint board directors. Of course, they vote at the ASM. We've got that coming up at the end of this month, but they don't appoint and nominate like they would if we were a state-owned enterprise. So this mixed ownership model structure, which was set up, I think probably about 10 years ago for New Zealand, where there's 3 energy companies and also Air New Zealand in it, is well designed and thought through. And it's that you've got a government shareholder, but that doesn't mean you've got an interventionist or interfering government shareholder. The other part of the government, of course, is the Energy Ministry and the Energy Minister and MB that we engage with on a regular basis. And we work with them and the Energy Minister in shaping the future of the sector and where we may be going. And there's lots of debate in New Zealand around how renewable can the electricity sector become and what's the trade-off between renewable electricity and renewable energy. And you may have heard us talk in the past about, well, we believe that New Zealand's electricity sector can become a lot more renewable. In fact, we're committed ourselves to removing 1.2 million tonnes of carbon between 2020 and 2025. We've signed up to a science-based target that commits us to doing that, and I can talk more about that. But we also argue that actually the big opportunity for New Zealand is not getting overly exercised about whether we end up at 95, 96, 98 or 100% renewable electricity, but it's how do you use that renewable electricity to decarbonize other sectors in the energy pie, in particular transport and industrial heat. Huge opportunity for New Zealand if we want to go down a decarbonising journey, which of course we do, because we're well ahead of other countries in terms of what percentage of renewable electricity we have, and that gives us an opportunity to move first and fastest to decarbonise other parts of the economy with electricity. So we engage with the Energy Minister and the Energy Ministry on that, and that's a different relationship to the shareholding one.
Cool. Thanks, Marc. Yeah, I'm interested in this kind of low carbon future. In the annual report, as you've just said, you've got a target of removing more than 1.2 tonnes of carbon by 2025, which is just around the corner, and reducing emissions by 36%. So I'm wondering what actions you and Genesis are taking at the moment to move towards that and how you're tracking towards those measurements.
Yep. So it's 1.2 million tonnes, Chris, between 2020 and 2025, which is a big number. And it would make us, we think, the biggest single contributor to carbon reduction in New Zealand over that time frame. And the actions are simply to replace what we call base load thermal generation, which is base load means it's always on pretty much, and it's mainly gas. It's base load, occasionally a bit of coal, but it's mainly gas, is to replace that with lower cost renewable generation. So we started that journey a couple of years ago. The first new wind farm in New Zealand for 6 years was up and running this year. It's called YPP in South Taranaki, and we got that going with Tilt Renewables, which was an independent power provider, now been purchased by Mercury. But their role was to build the wind farm. Our role was to contract for 20 years with it to enable them to get the financing to go and build it. So the first of several what we call power purchase agreements were signed a couple of years ago, and then that wind farm has been successfully brought to bear this last year. We've since signed 2 more PPA contracts, one for the Kaiwaikawa wind farm in Northland, which is yet to be built, but will be over the next couple of years. And then we've also signed a PPA with a competitor, in this case, Contact Energy, for some geothermal that they're building. And it's our long-term commitment to buying that power that enables some of these projects to be developed and enables us to then say, well, we can reduce the amount of baseload thermal in the New Zealand electricity system to ensure that we reduce the carbon emissions and hit that 1.2 million tonne target for 2025. And so we're well on our way. We've also committed this year to building ourselves, as part of a joint venture with a partner, 500 megawatts of solar. So in the final stages of negotiating the terms of that joint venture with 2 partners, and we'll come down to 1 very shortly and announce that in the market. And that should see Genesis as one of the largest builders of industrial scale solar in New Zealand over the next 5 to 10 years. That's really exciting because there hasn't been a lot of industrial scale solar built in New Zealand so far. Most of the renewables have been geothermal or wind, and then obviously much more historically hydro. So we're well on our way, and we're looking forward to delivering that. And at the same time as doing that, we see our role is also then, well, we're doing this, which is the right thing to do. It's a cost reduction for us as well as a carbon reduction. But we also need to have this, what we call an honor with the company, which is when you rely on the weather so much for your electricity, you have to have backup. You can't run an economy on the weather, because we all know the weather's, but we're also articulating the importance of backup thermal for those non-wind days and those dry periods in the lakes, and also overnight when the solar is not able to produce. So there's lots of interesting dynamics in electricity, and I could spend a long time talking about it, but the important thing is to have balance and have options, particularly in your sources of electricity, so that you don't run out when everyone needs it in that peak I described earlier when everyone turns on.
Cool. Thanks, Marc. I'm not sure what I said, but did I say 1.2 tons of carbon by 2025? Because if so, that would be a nice and easy one to tick off, I would imagine. 1.2 million, far more ambitious. So yeah, Marc, I'm interested in an asset like the Huntly Power Station, and how that plays in terms of a low carbon future.
Yeah, so Huntly is the last and the biggest thermal plant in New Zealand. There are some others. There are some plants that are smaller peakers, gas peakers that others own, but Huntly is a big station that has multiple plants within it. It sits in a really important geography between Auckland and Hamilton, on the Waikato River, with good access to roads, a gas pipeline from Taranaki, and it's one of New Zealand's most important industrial assets, really. And it's the kind of the backbone of the energy system, not just from an electricity perspective, but also in its ability to move gas through it, because it's got optionality around different fuels. So as we decarbonize and reduce the dependency on it, it will have a different role. And it was the role I described earlier as backup rather than baseload. It'll generate less often, but when it's needed, it'll really be needed. And there are some conversations going on around, biomass, for example. We're currently doing a trial on biomass that could replace the coal that we occasionally use in some of the boilers there, which is a more renewable fuel. And the government are talking about Lake Onslow, which some people may have heard about, which is a large pumped hydro system in the South Island. And there's a project going on that the government are running at the moment called the New Zealand Battery Project. And it really is, how does New Zealand back up the system in 5, 10, 15 years' time when we've got even more renewables? And what role does a Huntly play with thermal versus a pumped hydro scheme in the South Island? There's possibilities of pumped hydro in North Island too. Biomass, coal, gas, what's the right mix? And despite the kind of the headlines you often see around the anti-gas, anti-coal types thing, there is strong recognition behind the scenes in government that you need options for fuels. You can't rely on one single backup source. And so we'll be going through this debate over the next few years, I suspect, and Genesis is playing an active role in that. But we see the location of the Huntly Power Station as really critical to that backbone of the system I talked about. But it will evolve. It will evolve from being high carbon to lower carbon, to use less often, but when it's used, it's really needed. And we think there's a strong future for Huntly, but it's going to be a different type of Huntly by the time we get into the 2030s.
Great, thanks, Marc. And sort of going back to what you were saying before about not necessarily relying on the weather to provide electricity, and you do need to have backup options. It is quite topical. Just given earlier this year, a couple of months ago, there was that power cut to several thousand homes on one of the coldest nights of the year. I guess I'm quite interested to hear your take on this, and perhaps more importantly, have there been any steps that have been put in place to ensure that this type of thing doesn't happen again?
Yeah, so that was a really unfortunate night. And the kind of public uprising or the media uprising the following day was probably testament to how rare this happens, or how rarely it happens. But it's not an uncommon thing in other parts of the world to occasionally have that problem. It's not good when you've got to turn the power out to houses on a cold night. And most of the lessons learned, I think, are really communication lessons. A lot of those homes didn't need to have the power turned out. But nevertheless, as a sector, we do have to put in place solutions that ensure it rarely happens, if it happens at all. And there's still reports to come out with learnings that will all be adopted by the sector, I'm sure. But I've been saying publicly that it's an early warning that we should take note of, which is when you do rely on the weather. And what happened that night was a number of things all coincided at the same time. It was the highest single demand for electricity New Zealand had ever seen in a single period. We also had a lot of outages, sort of planned outages in the South Island, which meant a lot of plant wasn't running. We'd also put to bed one of the Rankine units at Huntly a month earlier, after a long dry period where it had been supporting dry lakes, and the lakes had been filled up again. It wasn't required because of so much water in the lakes. But then when you got to this really cold night, the wind also fell away very quickly. So hundreds of megawatts of wind that had been producing earlier in the day suddenly disappeared from the system. And then we had a problem at one of our plants in the central North Island where we got weed infestation because of previously, earlier in the day, gale force winds pushing weeds into an intake gate. So you had a lot of different things, and those that work in big companies, industrial situations, will know the Swiss cheese metaphor, where all the holes suddenly align, you've got a problem, but it's rare that all those holes align. And so we will take lessons from it. But the biggest lesson, apart from communication, is probably that you've got to have options. You've got to have more than one option for those scenarios so you can bring it in quickly. And different power stations have different lead times. And you may have heard, anyone who followed the media over the 2 days after that will have heard me say it takes us between 6 and 12 or 5 and 10 hours to stand up a Rankine unit on coal. A coal-fired power station, for all its ills, is not something that can be turned on quickly. So if we're going to have more wind in the system over the next 10 years, which can drop out very quickly when the wind stops blowing, we're going to have power stations that can turn on really quickly to fill the gap. And so I think we will take all those learnings and we'll put in place. And it's a competitive market, so every competitor will be thinking about what their role is in that. And I'm sure it'll be a pretty rare occurrence if it ever happens again.
That's really interesting to hear. Thanks, Marc. Now, I might actually move on to some of the questions that have been asked by people tuning in, because there are a handful, and want to make sure that we get through some of them. So our first one says, "Hi Marc, what is Genesis doing in the LPG sector to future-proof against government regulations and climate accords?"
Yeah, so LPG is a really interesting part of New Zealand's retail energy pie, if you like. In the time I've been here, we've been actively growing our market share and our presence in it because it's the fastest growing fuel. So whereas electricity demand in New Zealand is growing between 0.5% and 1% a year, demand for LPG has been growing about 5 or 6% per year. And there's a number of reasons for all that, and we often explain this to our institutional investors when we do our roadshows, because they're all they kind of look a bit perplexed by it. So one of the reasons is that South Island never had reticulated pipelines put in, so you don't get piped gas and natural gas in South Island, but you do in some parts of North Island. But if you're living in Christchurch and you've gone through the earthquake 10 years ago, the sense of energy security is really important. So we speak to our customers down there, and they often say, I'm not sure I want to trust the electricity system to not let the lights go out when there's a crisis. And storms can also, we talked about weather earlier on the 9th of August issue, but storms can also knock down networks temporarily and lights can go out. And so customers often say, well, I like having 2 LPG bottles at the back of my house. I can turn the heating on, I can have my hot shower, I can cook my dinner, and I don't have to worry about whether electricity is working or not. So that's a really interesting psychology. It's sort of a dependence on a more distributed form of energy, because the energy is at your house. You don't have to rely on a big central system, and people seem to like that. We also hear in North Island that when new buildings are developed or new communities are being built and there's a big shortage of housing, and as you know, we need more, developers are deciding it's too expensive to go and connect to the reticulated gas network, which might be hundreds of meters or a kilometer away from your home. And so they're saying, oh, well, we don't want to do that. Let's go and just put 2 gas bottles and a connection behind the house. And so you've got big communities in all parts of New Zealand growing that way, and it's LPG. I hear volcanic rock is an issue in Auckland too. Here in Auckland, I've got piped gas, but a couple of streets down the road, it's LPG bottles because they couldn't get gas pipelines into the ground. So it is a really important fuel today for New Zealand as part of the energy pie. But even despite that, less than 20% of homes will have LPG. When we look forward from a climate change agenda perspective, we see our role at Genesis as empowering New Zealand's sustainable future. Now, we want to help customers make the choices that matter to them. We don't need to decide now whether there's going to be a big change in the LPG demand in 5, 10, 15 years' time, because we can be quite reactive to that. But you will, as consumers, start to see us telling you that if you converted your home to be 100% electricity, this is what you could save from a carbon emissions perspective. And if you want to do that, this is how you might want to think about doing it, move from a gas fire to a heat pump. But if you want LPG, we're going to supply you LPG. We're not going to cut you off. And we think consumers should make those choices, not in a centralized government way. Despite all that, policies may start to shift things. The cost of LPG might rise because of the emissions trading scheme and the impost of carbon on it, just like piped gas. And so we will be responsive and agile to that. But it's a relatively low fixed cost sector. So unlike a gas pipeline that has to be put in the ground and has to last 30 years, the infrastructure for LPG is not that material to the overall cost of it. And so we think it's going to be quite a resilient fuel as we go through this transition for New Zealand. And much of the decarbonising in New Zealand can happen at the big end of town, not everyone's homes. But that said, I do think consumers have a role to play too.
Thanks, Marc. That kind of leads us on to the next question that has been asked from Clint, which is, in your opinion, what energy future should we plan for and how long will the transition take?
Well, that's a big question. We do need to plan for a lower carbon energy future. Today in New Zealand, although electricity is 80-85% renewable, and with all the things I've talked around our strategy and displacing baseload of 1.2 million tons of carbon, so we'll eventually be, within this decade, we'll be 95% renewable for electricity. But the real opportunity, if you take energy as a whole, which includes petroleum, transport fuels, coal and gas for industrial processing, and transport, obviously, we're only about 40% renewable. And as I said earlier in the conversation, we've got an opportunity to become more renewable. And so we need to be looking at how we get to 50%, 60%, 70% and more from a total energy perspective. And electricity provides a big opportunity there, but it's not going to solve everything. So we know now today that if you're an industrial customer and you want to heat your hot water for steam, technology is evolved, but below 150 degrees centigrade, electricity can heat your steam and you don't need to use coal and gas. And we know today that you can drive a car on electricity fairly easily, although there's a capital cost issue, but that's coming down. But we know big trucks, big heavy duty vehicles, it's going to be harder. So we might need another solution. It might be hydrogen, it might be something else. But really, as consumers and investors, we need to be planning for a lower carbon future. But we need to do it in a way, and this is a big part of what Genesis argues publicly, but also behind the scenes with government. We need to do it in a way that isn't disruptive to the average consumer, that takes them on that journey. And that's why we say our purpose is empower New Zealand's sustainable future. It's about doing it together. And we think as a company, we have a role to play in providing some of that knowledge and advice to consumers about what they choose to do, as well as talking to government and policymakers about what they choose to do. And we're sitting in the middle of it with a business. We know what we're choosing to do, which is decarbonize our base load thermal, take out that 1.2 million tons. We've signed up to a science-based target, but when we look across our business, informing the government to do it in a way that is not too disruptive for the population of New Zealand, and we think that's possible.
Awesome. And just something I picked up in there, you mentioned hydrogen. Someone here has asked, I'd like to hear more about how you will develop your green hydrogen thesis.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a skeptic on hydrogen, and it's not because I don't think it's an awesome thing or an idea or concept, but the world is getting very excited about hydrogen, and I fear that it might be a bit of a white elephant in the short term, but I hope it provides a really important component in the long term. And it depends what you're talking about when you say hydrogen. I mean, hydrogen already exists. There's a reasonable amount of hydrogen in lots of industrial processes, including fertilizer manufacturing today. So hydrogen is not a new thing. When people are talking about green hydrogen, they're talking about the process of converting water into hydrogen through electrolysis. That technology has existed for a long time too, but is really expensive, very energy intensive, and you lose about 50% of the energy in the process. So the hydrogen you have at the end of the process is only 50% of the energy you started with. So just think about that from an energy productivity perspective. And I'm quite interested in this idea of energy productivity. So the energy you put in versus the energy you get out. If you then take that hydrogen and you use it to generate electricity again, like so you put it into a power station, you lose another about, 60% of the original. So you end up with about 30% of the energy output. If you go electricity, hydrogen, electricity, you lose 70%, you end up with 30%. That's really energy intensive. And I think there's some really deep questions that need to be asked around whether that's the best path to global decarbonizing in the short to medium term. But again, I mentioned earlier, electricity can't do everything. So we know that hydrogen could play and should play a role in some high temperature heat processing and potentially heavy duty transport as well. So we have a role for hydrogen, but I'm just not sure it's going to be in generating electricity in the short to medium term. So I also look at New Zealand as the size of the economy versus the rest of the world. And one of the things everyone should be aware of about New Zealand is it's got a lot of indigenous energy. So we've got a lot of hydro, wind, geothermal, solar, gas. We've even got a bit of coal. It's all here in New Zealand. We don't need to import it. The parts of the world that are going to invest billions and billions of dollars in the R&D around how do you reduce the cost and reduce the energy intensity of hydrogen are parts of the world that don't have their energy independence. So you'll see Germany and Japan are two countries in particular who are getting heavily into it. They're relying on countries that they don't feel secure. Germany relies on gas from Russia, for example, and Japan relies on coal and other fuels from other parts of Asia, in particular China. They have a huge geopolitical incentive to invest. As New Zealand, we should be watching them, and we should be observing, fast follower. And when the technology evolves and becomes cheaper and more energy or less energy intensive, we should be there very quickly. So the question is a good one. We have a thesis, but it's not necessarily jumping on the bandwagon. It's watching, observing, and thinking about what's New Zealand's role versus others, and at what point does New Zealand really move quickly. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
No, those are really, really interesting thoughts. Thanks, Marc. Sorry, Chris, you go.
That's all right. Perfect. So, Marc, the next question here is from Peter. Thanks for writing this in, Peter. Would you consider battery storage as backup rather than thermal?
Yes, I'm a big fan of lithium-ion batteries and how they're evolving technologically. They are different to backup thermal in a couple of ways. I mean, every source of energy generation has a different dynamic. Some have high peaking capacity from a megawatts perspective. Some have high energy capacity. Some are reactive. They can be turned on quickly. Some are turned on slowly. Batteries are the same, or any form of energy storage is the same. And what batteries are really good for is quick response, but they're not high capacity. So if you compare them to a coal stockpile at Huntly for a dry year, say 3 months of drought in South Island, it's almost impossible to replace that coal stockpile with batteries. But if batteries can play a role in backing up the wind, so you can have a wind farm with lithium-ion batteries attached to it, where, if your wind drops off for a few minutes, the battery can kick in really quickly and can provide some backup. So you've got a kind of more continuous form of generation. But one of the things that New Zealand has is a real asset in its electricity sector. We haven't actually talked that much about it, but it's 60% of our generation is our hydro schemes, already very renewable and really responsive. And for the most part, all the wind farms in New Zealand today, and many that will be built in the future, will be backed up by the hydro schemes, because you can turn them on and off really quickly. They're renewable already, and they effectively are energy storage. So we're not unlike other markets like Australia, where you might see the narrative they don't have the volume of hydro as part of the market. They quickly need to build batteries to back up their wind. New Zealand isn't as much urgency around that, but we will see batteries emerge for other reasons too. Some of the network support type things are a bit more complex to explain, but we will see grid scale batteries emerge in New Zealand. I just think they won't be as fast as some other countries, because we've got other capabilities we can bring to bear.
Great. Thank you, Marc. I think we're almost out of time for today. So we'll make that the last question from people tuning in. So thank you so much for everyone who has listened in today. And thank you so much, Marc, for your time. We've really appreciated your time and insights. I, for one, find the electricity and energy sector very fascinating. And it's so interesting to, talk about some of these trends that are happening.
Thanks for being here, Marc. We really appreciate it.
Cool. So please check out our daily financial news podcast recap. It's about 10 minutes long and is published at 5 p.m. Monday to Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And next Thursday, we will be joined by Andrew, who is the Chief Operating Officer of TradeWindow. Now, TradeWindow is an Auckland-based tech company who have just held a capital raise and are planning to list on the New Zealand Stock Exchange sometime very soon. So you can register through the link in the chat.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you've had an enjoyable lunch, or have an enjoyable lunch if you're going to go have that afterwards. And we'll see you next Thursday. Have a great week and stay safe.